Today we will look at a very important subject. We will understand how the devil has fomented the great city of Babylon upon all the nations of the world. That Babylon is the great city that reigns above all the kings of the earth, and how this spiritual structure is located throughout the earth by way of webs of communication lines with conduits that unite the great cities that the devil has formed over time throughout the earth. The scripture says in Revelation 18 and 23, "The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore, and the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all nations were deceived." We see here that the great harlot will use some form of enchantment or witchcraft, but at a much higher level than the usual sorceries used by a shaman or sorcerer on people. Rather, it will be a global system of magic by which the harlot will govern the nations of the earth. And this global system is called magical geometry or sacred geometry. Sacred geometry is what the devil began to feed the shamans and priests throughout the great civilizations of ancient times. He gave them the knowledge of how to design and build in the spiritual realm. We must understand that it is the spiritual world that reigns and controls, and it also assigns, dictates, and transforms the natural world. From the beginning, the devil has been very interested in building the spiritual world. From his fall, and when the fallen angels or Nephilim that united with women came to occupy the earth, they established themselves throughout the nations and fomented the great dominions. The devil began to give them revelation of how to connect the great cities with magical locations or points of power in the earth, with the goal of having one nation governing all the other nations. So through the use of sacred geometry, Satan starts to show the shamans and priests where the points of power and where the openings are, which will allow portals to connect the abyss with the second heaven. Let's not forget that this spiritual city will not only cover the high and heavenly places, but also cover the earthly spheres and the nether places. So he begins to create a series of portals and pillars, a whole slew of buildings that will build this spiritual city. This entails assigning magical geometry to the buildings in their designs. It applies to temples, structures, and megaliths such as Stonehenge, which we'll be discussing shortly. It all starts with something called the omphalos, which is the Greek word for navel or belly button. From the beginning of anything, all else stems from one central point. In the universe, everything moves around a central point. All planetary systems orbit around a central point. Families were established and they will all unite around the fireplace to plan and form civilizations. All cities are established around a central point. If you travel to any city anywhere, you will see a central point in it. It is from the center that a city is governed. These central points were then called omphalos of the earth. These earthly belly buttons are the portals or openings that are the primary sources of unification between the spiritual world of darkness and the cities of the earth. So the devil begins by marking these centers of power around the earth. It isn't as simply as some men arbitrarily choosing a random place to build a village and developing into a city. The great civilizations were not established that way, but rather through a demonic intelligence that led them to these strategic points. It is in these places where the power would arise. The devil had already planned and designed with accuracy these points of power from which he will govern the nations of the earth, so he will direct men where to establish their city. And we have spoken about Mexico being an example of this. Mexico has an envelope, and in fact, the name implies being the navel of the world. Mexico has one of the most important portals of death in the earth, and it is where the Aztecs established their city. Here we see in this figure a classic omphatic formation. We will see this repeatedly in obelisks and monuments that are found throughout the cities. We see a structure with a central point, and this is quite usual in squares in the cities or in key places in order to delimit a center of power from which the devil can operate his government. There are other structures that have an elliptical shape and look like the ball used in football. These are called Vesica pieces and are among the most important geometric forms within magical geometry. We see this type of forms in Mecca and in the Vatican, and they are envelopes from which emanates a great power that captivates the masses. We also see how the Egyptians built these great pyramids. These shapes were not randomly chosen as graves for the kings. You might think perhaps it seems like a cute shape for their pharaohs to live in the afterlife. Not at all, but rather there was an understanding of magical geometry. If you would do a careful study of the pyramids at Giza, you will notice that not only are they connected with other parts of Egypt, but they are built in perfect alignment and in proportion to the constellation of Orion. Why, you might say? These pyramids are in fact governed through a spiritual conduit that connects the second heaven to earth. Let us remember that the Bible refers to the stars as being angels. We see in the book of Revelation that it says that the third part of the stars fell, and this is in reference to Satan falling and taking with him the third part of the angels. These stars are quite diverse and are occupied by spiritual principalities and powers that control the conduits which are connected to the sacred geometry. This is how the devil consolidates his seat of power. So by using certain symbols and geometric forms, the devil began to define a systematic occult wisdom and edification, which we will see repeated in the great temples of the earth. Satan not only used this sacred science and geometry in the ancient civilization, but also with the Celts. Through invocations, the Celts discovered that the devil had assigned rocks and mounds and seats of power throughout England. And so they began to put spiral markings on certain rocks and dig out circles around rocks, as in the classical megalithic formation called Stonehenge, which entails making a circle of rocks with a center point where the powers of darkness may be summoned. This is an actual portal to hell, so they began to connect points of lesser power with points of greater power. Now we will see how the great cathedrals, cemeteries and temples and rocks and megaliths in England are connected by what we call the ley lines. Ley lines are lines of power that unite points chosen by the devil. These are points of powerful energy that connect places with straight lines. Physically speaking, ley lines unite the points in the Earth's tectonic plates where magnetic energy is dissipated. The Earth has two poles, north and south, and is founded on layers of energy that unite the two poles. So the energy travels throughout the Earth much like our body lymphatic system throughout which energy flows. The magnetic energy of the Earth travels through the layers of the tectonic plates. So the shamans and sorcerers use these lines as conduits of power called ley lines, and they connect these magnetic points of energy. In the spiritual realm, these lines form avenues that the principalities and demons use to connect with their military army, and they also connect one temple to another in order to help each other and strengthen their power. It is much like having an electrical grid which is connected with wires to different stations throughout electrical towers and therefore connecting all the points. In the spiritual world, this is a ley line. We have a central point of power called the envelope or navel, which acts as the main electrical station that connects to the lesser points or towers. In electricity, when we have a cable conducting a great amount of current connecting to a cable conducting weaker current, the result is called induction. A greater current feeds a lesser current. So, in order to achieve a greater power in a small town with a weak center, it must be connected to the greater sources of power found in the big cities, with greater envelopes or to the ancient places of power. So with these ley lines, all the Earth is connected to the points of power, forming a web or a magnetic grid. This system of ley lines is an occult knowledge that the devil has been sharing with certain men throughout the civilizations. And we will see that as we begin to analyze them using modern technological tools, we are astounded as we see how these mega temples and megaliths, that are these awesome constructions made from huge stones, harness magnetic or spiritual power. For example, the Egyptian pyramids, Stonehenge in England, Teotihuacan in Mexico, Machu Picchu in Peru, Mecca in Arabia, the temples in Japan. All these edifices are somehow connected. If we analyze them, we see an exact line that runs across the equator and touches all the great megaliths of the earth. Is this all a coincidence? Or is there an intelligent demonic influence behind all this that inspired the men of the ancient civilizations to build these strange structures that even today's architects are baffled by them? We are not even able to figure out how these massive stones were lifted and moved by the Incans or at Stonehenge. Even right here in Florida, we have Coral Castle, an important magic place and portal of power that was built by a single and frail man who understood the magnetic forces of the earth. He figured out a way to defeat gravity and was able to lift huge stones and corals in order to build Coral Castle with his bare hands. This terrible occult knowledge also helped the builders of the pyramids. It is a mystery on how they were able to move these huge stones. How they were able to construct the pyramids continues to baffle modern scientists. And we that understand the spiritual realm know that the devil was the one who furnished the knowledge and the power to the ancient civilizations on how to build this type of structures. So these ley lines are the ones that connect the different power points from the Earth magnetic grid and will give way to the opening of the portals that allow communication between the underworld or the bowels of the earth with the rest of the universe. Now we will see a very interesting thing, and it is that all this discovery was made by Plato, the famous Greek philosopher. And this Greek philosopher was the author of what we know today as geometry. And we have all studied geometry in school, and we have studied the different geometric shapes, such as the cube, the icosahedron, the octahedron, and all these voluminous forms that have equal sizes, such as forms with several triangles or several squares or several pentagons, and so on. So these geometric forms were discovered by Plato, and he is the one that discovered all these forms and these philosophies. And in his theory, he said that all the universe functioned mathematically. And I believe this is true. After all, God is the greatest mathematician, and everything that he has created is made in a mathematical perfection. The problem is that the devil has usurped this knowledge to build and organize his spiritual cities. Now, going back to Plato, he discovered that everything in the universe functions through a symmetry of equal-sided bodies. And he discovered that there were 5 main shapes by which all the magical geometry can be elaborated from. And these magical shapes will become the cornerstones in the edification of all these great temples and consequently the centers of power such as Masonic lodges and all that has to do with occultic magic. So he discovered that these geometric forms that I wanted to name one by one, and the first one is going to be the tetrahedron. And the pyramids in Egypt are made after a tetrahedron, which is composed of 4 triangles. So Plato decided that because of the sharpness of each of the points of these equilateral triangles in the tetrahedron, these 4 points represented the 4 elements. And the tetrahedron will refer to the fire because of its pointy form. The second form he discovered was the octahedron. This results by putting together 8 equilateral triangles, or 2 tetrahedrons. So the octahedron, 8 sides, 8 equal triangles, and this octahedron shape has to do with air. So he theorized, and he felt it this way, that within the octahedron, water would separate from fire and air would be contained in the midst of this shape. So we need to understand these shapes because this is not just about simply looking at a map and tracing some random shape. There are certain shapes that have to do with spiritual entities, and there are certain shapes that connect with other centers of power. And so it becomes very important which shape we have to discover within a map and what are the tracing of the different ley lines or geometric shapes in a spiritual map. The next shape is the cube. The cube has a total of 6 equal square sides, and being the most solid and stable of all the geometric figures, it is associated with the earth. The next one is the icosahedron, which is comprised of 20 triangles and is theorized as being associated with water. Now, when we look at the powers of the waters and how they function, we will find as well some forms of icosahedrons. If I am not mistaken, the great ball at Epcot Center that looks like a huge golf ball is composed of a number of icosahedrons, and it is supposed to symbolize the spiritual world and has to do with the waters. Now, the most complicated figure in Plato's geometry is the dodecahedron. The dodecahedron is comprised of 12 pentagons that are united, and according to the great philosophers, is the most mysterious and magical of all the Platonic figures. It also has to do with the great cosmos. So we will see these figures repeated in art, in architecture. We're going to see them repeatedly in the great temples. And so we need to see to what they are connected and why are they connected in this manner. It is important to understand that the great temples of the earth were constructed over ley lines. Temples, or the king's palaces, were not constructed in a random place. There was always a research to find out where two ley lines connected in order to build them in these places so they can become a center of power. In black magic, by example, or wherever diabolical covenants are made, one of the things they usually do is to take dirt from where two roads meet. Where two roads meet, we found there is power in that place. And this is a law that is as well a physical law and a spiritual law. Where two lines cross, and in this case they are ley lines and centers of power, and in such places the witches and the sorcerers draw out dirt in order to strengthen and feeding their conjures. So in these ley lines, temples and the palaces of the kings were built. In Asia, by example, they have a specific name, and they call these lines dragon lines. And the Chinese also understood that there were magnetic lines in the earth, that they were lines of power that united the different points in the layers of the tectonic plates. They will call these dragon lines. The Chinese thought that a great dragon was revealing itself in the earth, and by connecting the dragon lines or ley lines, they could manifest this dragon to govern or to rule all these Asian countries. I remember when we went to Hiroshima to redeem the land from the atomic bomb. Hiroshima is located in a river delta. A delta is where multiple rivers merge, and Hiroshima is edified over this delta. There, we saw a great dragon. If you see the map of Japan, it has the shape of a dragon. And the dragon plays an important role throughout all the Oriental cultures. There we saw that this river that stems from Hiroshima was developing the circulatory system of this dragon. So the Lord directed us to do prophetic acts in order to cancel and to break the power of this dragon. Shortly after came the great tsunami of March 11 in this very important area of witchcraft, and therein is located the head of the dragon, which we had previously tackled through the prophetic acts in Hiroshima. So here we see how the darkness was using the connection of these rivers as conduits. Rivers are highly important in magic geometry. Many of the ancient civilizations were established along the rivers and other bodies of water because the rivers are very powerful conduits of ley lines. And in this case, I will not label them as ley lines because ley lines are necessarily straight lines, but they are nevertheless lines of power because they do connect one point of power with another. Now, let us remember that when the great flood came and it destroyed the whole earth, all the demons that operated on earth lost the human vessels they were operating from. But the water spirits remain intact. And water is a very effective conductor for spirits. All these civilizations do connect through the waters. For example, the Vatican. The city of the Vatican was not founded there because of the supposed burial place of the Apostle Peter. Absolutely not. The Apostle Peter's tomb is definitely not there. The true reason was because of the strategic ley lines that crossed in that place. The Vatican City is perfectly aligned with the pyramids of Egypt and Mecca. And if you analyze the map, you will see this. I remember that in 1999, we were doing a major spiritual warfare that included many nations. And this operation was called Dominion of the Queen, because during that time, Pope John Paul II was planning for the year 2000 to name Mary co-redemptory with Jesus and part of the Trinity. Can you imagine what a horrible abomination this would have been? So we decided we were not going to let this happen. So we did a tremendous assault in the Vatican to stop the works of the devil, bearing in mind that we don't wage war with flesh and blood, but rather against the spiritual forces. And we were not warring against the Pope, but against the powers that were controlling the Pope in that moment. We also wanted the Catholic Church to receive the revelation of salvation through Jesus Christ. So, as we traveled to the site, we noticed how the ley lines were laid out. If you do a bird's eye view of St. Peter's Square, you notice that it looks like an old-style keyhole of a door. Today, the keyholes have a different shape, but in the old days, the keyhole had a round upper part and a rectangular bottom part. So, if you look at St. Peter's Square, it resembles a keyhole. In the middle of the round part, there is an obelisk. When you hear about obelisks, they function as points of demarcation for ley lines. Thus, they are doors that lead as conduits directly to the center of the earth and hell. Wherever there is an obelisk, it is connected to death, and the obelisk represents the god Osiris. In the legend of Osiris, he dies, and then he's placed in the Nile River. Then the goddess Isis cuts off his genitals in order to perpetuate his life and therefore remain alive through the centuries. So she began to promote the establishment of obelisks everywhere, which signifies Osiris' sexual organ through which the earth is procreated and the doors to hell are opened. So obelisks are very important since they are portals to hell and they are clear and visible points of ley lines. When we went to the Vatican and in St. Peter's Square, you can find the obelisk and these ray-like lines that proceeded from it. And these rays are pointing to certain directions, and if you follow the lines which issue out of the obelisk, you will see that St. Peter's Square is well connected as the lines lead to the great temples and the great megaliths of the earth. Is all of this coincidental, or did a diabolical intelligence plan it out? When we took on the Vatican, I remember the Lord telling us that it was constructed like a door. In fact, we will see this door pattern in the building of points of power within the construction of cathedrals. And the Lord directed us to penetrate the Vatican and doing it as if someone is opening a door. And we learned that obelisks are activated, and this is very important to know, that ley lines are activated by way of the sun. So the Lord told us that when dawn was at hand, the shadow of the obelisk will be projected above the door of St. Peter. When the shadow of the obelisk will touch the door of the Basilica of St. Peter, at that precise moment, the spiritual world will open in the Vatican and thus allowing us to enter. So we went there at 4 a.m. in prayer, and we saw a terrible door that was leading to the underworld. And it was one of the most impressionable moments in spiritual warfare that I have ever lived. We literally saw a huge hole. And in this gigantic hole were countless prisons. And there was a terrible demon called the incarcerator. When people in the natural world would arrive At the Vatican, he will trap them and stick them in these prisons. And not only the visitors, but also those connected through the ley lines. So this incarcerator, and it is not by coincidence that the Apostle Paul arrived in Rome, and the first thing that happened to him was that he was put into jail, because Rome is governed by an incarcerator. So we saw all these prisons and entire nations were caught in them. As we began to pray, we saw how they opened up and myriads of angels that will come into this great pit. And the prison's door were open and the angels started to pull out the people. And I could clearly see how Mexico was coming out of these prisons. And I saw millions of people and the tattered and putrid Mexican flag. And millions of people coming out. And today we are seeing how these millions of Mexicans are coming to the feet of Jesus Christ. Well, all this to say that ley lines are activated by the sun rays. And this is why it's so important in many pyramids around the world, the winter solstice and the summer equinox. In Chichen Itza, for example, on March 21st, which is the spring equinox, when the sun strikes an orifice, the serpent of Kukulkan becomes manifested. And going back to the Vatican, the Lord told us when the sun casts a shadow, something will happen. So we were all very focused as we look for the extension of the shadow as the sun will arise. Sure enough, the shadow began to grow, but curiously, the shadow did not grow directly above the door as I was expecting, but it was growing towards the left side of the building. And if you look at the door, directly to its left is the statue of St. Peter holding the keys. So the shadow first began to grow over the statue of St. Peter, and at that precise moment, I saw a spiritual road opening up. The Lord instructed me to run quickly. He said, but you have only few seconds to snatch the keys from that principality that is hidden within the image of what is this supposed St. Peter. So I ran down that spiritual line that the shadow from the obelisk had created. I snatched the keys from St. Peter, and at that moment, as the day was advancing, the shadow began to move slowly towards the right, back towards the entrance door of the Vatican. At that moment, the physical door to the Vatican opened. Our war team entered into the Vatican to take possession of the Basilica of St. Peter, and we began to declare that all the lies and hidden sins of a cult would be exposed and demolished. This was a great battle and a great victory, because in the end, Mary was never declared as co-redemptor with Christ and part of the Trinity, or rather the Tetrarchy, as the Pope was intending to call it. So again, it was a great victory. The army of the Lord was able to cut and to obstruct the lines of communication that emanated from the depths of hell through these doors of power, where the designs of the kingdom of darkness are created and emerge onto the earth. I want to remind you that when Jesus led us to pray the Lord's Prayer, the prayer was to unite the designs of heaven with the designs of earth. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven. So the Lord came to unite earth with heaven, but the devil has united hell and the second heaven with the earth. Obviously, the second heaven is part of the kingdom of darkness, or any way you want to call it. Well, all this to say that ley lines are powerfully activated by the sun, and the doors as well. And may I say that this leads us to our next teaching, which have to do with the doors, and we have already touched on the subject of doors here, which are also omphalos. I remember on one occasion we were in Colorado, and the Lord took us into a profound experience. As we traveled into Nevada, we came across these rock formations, which are also part of this Colorado reddish and desert terrain. And these formations are very much the home of Native American shamans. So I went with a group of prophets to pray into this territory. As the sun began to set, I heard the Lord say to me, "Beware of the doors of the west, because the world of darkness opens through the doors of the west." The doors to the most powerful type of occult, the most dreadful doors open at the time of sundown. So we are now talking about two types of ley lines. One is the ley lines that are established or activated by the sun rays during the day, during the sunrise. And the second is the ley lines and the doors of the night, the doors of the occult that open at the sundown. In the world of the occult, the occultists call this the white powers and the black powers. Of course, for us it's all dark, but to them it's black and white, because of the polarities of the energies that they deal with. So, anyways, at sundown, the group of prophets that were there, we saw in a vision the doors of the occult begin to open, and we clearly saw these doors to the west opening. To us, the prophets that were present, it was quite a revelation. Then, in another occasion, we were taking one of the most important omphalos located in Germany. Omphalos are not only found in the center of cities, but also in islets. In certain rivers, for example, if you watch, you will find islets. These islets are consecrated, and if there are temples in the islet or certain kind of magical stones or weird designs, you should be pretty convinced that there is an omphalo and a door to the underworld. Well, in Berlin, Germany, they built the Museum of Pergamum. Remember that the Bible speaks of the temple of Satan as being located in Pergamus? Jesus says in the book of Revelation that Pergamus is the city where Satan has edified his throne. And there was literally a great temple there. So the Germans decided to take this great temple in Pergamus and relocated the entire complex to the islet located in the middle of the river in Berlin. They wanted to build a museum that will have the most powerful temples of the earth. So besides the throne of Satan in Pergamum, they brought the temple of Inanna directly from Iraq. This is the most ancient temple dedicated to the Queen of Heaven. Along with it, they brought a Hittite temple, which is one of the oldest temples in the Mesopotamian cultures. In total, they brought 6 temples to the location of the islet, and on top, they built a mosque. Next to it, they built a whole museum as a temple dedicated to the Egyptian pharaoh. So you can imagine the concentration of the powers of darkness brought together in this islet at the river in Berlin. Now, all this construction was done before the Second World War. And when Hitler saw it, he consecrated and used it as his seat of power and declared that because of the powers that were in operation in that islet museum, Germany was never going to be overcome. Of course, he never took into consideration that God will raise up Rees Howells. And Rees Howells, together with his intercessors, will bring down the power of the Third Reich. But nevertheless, this was the declaration that Hitler said about the powers of darkness in this very important omphalo of Germany. Well, during the time we took the Museum of Pergamum for the Kingdom of God, it was an extraordinary experience. For one consecutive month, a team of intercessory warriors rented a local across from the front of the museum and were in constant prayer and worship 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, loosening the power of God over the Museum of Pergamum. Later on, we rented an RV with all the trimmings, bedroom, living room, and everything. And there, we did a special prayer in the Spirit to get a glimpse of the spiritual configuration of the Pergamum Museum. In the prayer, the Lord showed us that the museum had 8 doors, and these 8 doors faced the west. Also, the museum was very well connected with very important points in Berlin. One in particular was the door of Berlin, and all of the most important doors in Berlin faced west. So it was amazing how we took the Pergamum Museum and we did a lot of very interesting things. Among them, we synchronized our watches and took note of the exact time of sundown according to the observatory. And on that particular day, and I believe it was around 5:21 or 22, and at that moment, and we were all holding pitchers with oil, and at the precise time, we broke the pitchers in front of each of the doors inside the museum. And all of this caused a great noise that was heard throughout the entire building. And then we moved forward to take on the doors of the museum. Now, all this gives you detail of how all these omphalos are edified over time. As we said before, omphalos are umbilical cords or centers of power, and whoever controls the center controls all the points connected to it. And this is how centers of powers are built. Now, among the important portals or gates that we must identify are caves. And caves are entrances to the spiritual realm. Also, volcanoes and its craters are very important. And I remember the time the Lord took us to El Salvador, and He said to us to do a spiritual battle at night, and we have to dive into a crater of a volcano that was already a lake, and we did a battle there. So we took all our scuba gear and starting the descent into the lake that was in the crater. So as we were going down, and we were with divers, the ones that rented all the equipment to us, and they were not Christian at all. So as we were descending, we literally heard screams. And when we came out of our diving, we started to talk to one another, and even the unbelievers asked us, what was those horrible screams we were hearing? It was like if we were outside in the land. So volcanoes are mouths and doors to hell. And many craters in the volcanoes are named like mouth of hell or Satan's pulpit and things like that. And these craters are directly connected not only to the magma under the earth, but also they are connected to hell in the spiritual realm. Now, caves are extremely important because they lead directly to the regions of death. During a time of spiritual warfare in Mexico that we fought against the powers of death, we had to take all the caves of death in Mexico and also the mines. All the mines have been consecrated to all kinds of demons. And all the mines are doors to the underworld, to the regions of hell. So whenever we look into the subject of doors, we must include caves. Another important thing to consider as we are identifying which are the doors of our city are certain trees. Trees are also used in magic. Some very old trees become targets of consecration because of their age or physical beauty. I remember in one instance during a warfare at the castle of Chapultepec in Mexico, we found a huge tree that was around 300 years old named the General. The site of this tree was used by witches and sorcerers to do their mumbo jumbo, and the Bible speaks of incantations, idolatries, and fornications committed at the foot of trees. We often find that there are trees where a huge amount of witchcraft and consecrations to the devil have been made at their foot. And because of the ceremonies in that place, they have become an opening or a vortex to hell. Adorations to the devil and conjures will cause spiritual doors to open onto regions of evil. In the same manner, Truthful worship and adoration to our God will open doors to heaven. For this reason, it is very important for us to close the doors of evil and open the doors of heaven in the territories where the devil has established doors of iniquity, doors that connect with the underworld, or doors that connect with the second heaven. There are certain high places or mounds where people claim to have seen UFOs. That is because these are points of power connected to ley lines and hence doors to the second heaven, allowing demons to travel up and down that many confuse with UFOs. We also have trees that have like cavities in the shape of a uterus, and these trees are greatly used by sorcerers as well. In Catemaco, Mexico, we found such trees where spells were done and the devil will appear in person. This one particular sequoia tree was full of fetish and witchcraft, all kind of paraphernalia. We also found a human hand, a mutilated hand wrapped in bloody rags and bound spells in the shape of people having intercourse, and many other horrible things that we found under these trees and this sequoia tree or old trees. Sometimes you might find a lush tree in the middle of a desert area. Most likely, this lush tree in the midst of a huge field are key places for shamans and sorcerers to do their spells and incantations. They are clear omphalos, especially if they are in indigenous areas or places of high witchcraft activity. The shamans, the warlocks, and the witches look for such places to do consecrations. They love these isolated, lush trees. Sorcerers also like trees that are located near rivers because they are like doors to hell. In the Yucatan Peninsula, where there are no rivers, the Mayans will use sinkholes or cenotes as doors to connect with their gods and to make sacrifice to them. They will throw virgin maidens and gold down these sinkholes because they were convinced that their gods would receive them. In their belief, these sinkholes contain various levels of the underworld, and as the sacrifices increase, the Mayans will assure a safe passage into the afterlife for their kings or for their relatives. So these cenotes or sinkholes are important doors to hell. Before I end this lesson, I want to return to the subject of magic geometry and share with you about a very important figure called the Vesica piscis. This figure is quite used by metaphysics, New Agers, and Freemasons. The Vesica piscis is based on the principle of a center of power. And the belief is that in the universe, everything revolves around a circle or a central point. And we have a radius that issues from that center and moves in a circular fashion, like we see it in the case of the sun and the earth revolving around the sun. Now, if we add a second circle with a radius, and that radius is circulating near the first circle, and then we put the two circles together, we are going to find in their intersection a shape which resembles a football. This common area in the shape of a football is called the Vesica piscis. And this Vesica piscis is the center of power responsible for activating all the other figures in magic geometry. So by the joining of circles, we see circles after circles after circles that are being formed. There is an incremental building of a web that creates greater Vesica piscis or flower shapes growing into bigger flower shapes. This continuous formation of flowers is called the flower of life. And we see this pattern repeatedly in many buildings, in many temples, and in many cathedrals. And we see various shapes that result from the intersecting circles, such as the square. And all the geometric shapes arise from the union of the circles. Therefore, it is important to understand the principle of the Vesica piscis as the center of power. This understanding is going to lead us to pray effectively as we do spiritual warfare and to break the centers of power, knowing where and how they were built into a place. If we can target the very points of power, we will destroy the works of the devil. Now, I would like to close in prayer because I am sure this class has been very intense for all of you. So, Father, in the powerful name of Jesus, it is written that you have given us a wisdom that if the princes of this world would have known, they would have never crucified the Lord of glory. It is a knowledge that is hidden from the eyes of all the heads of this world, the shamans, and even from the king of darkness himself. The hidden truth which is in your secret place, and you have given to us for us to see and to understand. But as it is written, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. And these things you have reserved for us. And I ask that as my brothers become fully equipped and with a revelation and understanding of the leylands and sacred geometry, that they may go into these places and be able to construct a proper and detailed spiritual mapping to be handed over to the generals in this battle. Or if they themselves are to be the generals, let them have a proper mapping that will allow them to pray effectively. In the powerful name of Jesus, I ask you that you give them the understanding to even close the doors in their own lives. Yes, my beloved brothers in Christ, in our own lives, there might be some doors that are open and need to be closed. If we are dealing with connections, with doors and alignments in this battle, it is very important that we take some time to pray. And I encourage you to even fast and ask the Lord to bring revelation of any area in your life that needs to be looked at in terms of open doors. And may I say, not all open doors have to be these grotesque doors we have been talking about. They might be small doors or areas in which you are still aligned. Minuscule as they might be, we must ensure they are dealt with prior to going into the battle. And these are doors, iniquities, and alignments from our past that God will reveal to you. The alignments which you are in communion with that is not from God have to be looked at. These doors must be closed and alignments canceled. Father, in the powerful name of Jesus, I loosen a prayer, generic as it might be. I believe it to be very effective in the spiritual realm, that as my brothers pray, all doors may be revealed. Let all ties and alignment with darkness be broken and canceled. And I loosen this word not only over this moment, but over the course of time in which they are praying, activating and breaking ties. This word is uniting with them in one accord so that any alignment that binds them to the kingdom of darkness may be broken and that all doors may be closed in their lives in the powerful name of Jesus Christ.